Imagine a regional economy so rich and so highly structured that it basically dictates the flow of continental trade.
Right.
Now, imagine that the entire foundation of this, well, I mean, the absolute bedrock of this commercial golden age is a state-sponsored mafia engaged in perpetual, unending warfare.
It sounds totally contradictory. Or
Completely. I mean, in most of our historical narratives, war is the ultimate destroyer. The army rolls in, the fields are burned, cities are sacked, and the local economy is just decimated. We are completely conditioned to believe that violence only destroys, that it can't construct anything of lasting value.
We really do operate on this very binary assumption, like peace brings prosperity and war brings poverty. And it makes intuitive sense. I mean, you can't exactly plant a field of millet or negotiate a complex trade agreement if you're constantly scanning the horizon for a cavalry charge.
Exactly. But I am really struggling with that assumption today, though, because we are stepping into the world of pre-colonial West Africa, specifically the Middle Niger Valley. And in this specific landscape, that exact binary is turned completely upside down. We are looking at this historical puzzle where, under very specific conditions, a state whose entire existence revolves around organized perpetual warfare is the exact thing that supercharges the regional economy.
It's a fascinating paradox.
It is. And then, to make the paradox even deeper, we will see what happens when that exact same war machine is taken over by a new set of rulers. And it causes the entire economic ecosystem to collapse practically overnight.
The historical and economic puzzle here is just profound. I mean, we have the exact same physical geography, the exact same basic economic actors, the same fundamental resources, but entirely different outcomes based purely on how the state manages its monopoly on violence.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you on a journey through roughly 200 years of history in the Middle Niger Valley.
Which is in what is now the modern Republic of Mali.
Right. Spanning from roughly 1712 to 1914. We are working through this incredibly detailed stack of notes based on the historical research of Richard L. Roberts, specifically his work, Warriors, Merchants, and Slaves.
It's a brilliant piece of research.
It really is. And our mission today is to trace the volatile, intimate relationship between three successive warrior states. So that's the Segu Bambara, the Umarians, and finally the French colonial military. We're going to look really closely at the economy they all desperately tried to control.
And the overarching framework to keep in mind here is that pre-colonial African economies were not static. They were highly dynamic, constantly adapting systems.
Right. They weren't just frozen in time waiting for outside influence.
Exactly. In the Middle Niger Valley, the survival of the state depended entirely on its ability to reproduce its capacity to make war. It had to fund that military apparatus somehow.
Yeah.
So how each of these three successive states intervened in the local economy to fund their specific brand of warfare, well, that changed the material reality for every single person living there.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this isn't just a top-down story of kings and generals drawing arbitrary lines on a map.
Not at all.
It's really the story of how fishermen, merchants, farmers, and ultimately enslaved people actively dictated the rise and fall of these regional superpowers.
Yeah, the everyday actors are the real drivers here.
Right. But before we get to the empires and the shifting ideologies, we need to understand the canvas. I mean, we need to look at the physical environment where this 200-year drama actually unfolds.
Well, the physical environment really dictates everything that follows. We are looking at a region close to the geographical center of continental West Africa, and it's characterized by three deeply distinct ecological zones, and they are layered right on top of each other.
It's a pretty extreme environment, right?
Very extreme. So in the south, you have the dry Sudan savanna. Then moving north, the landscape shifts into the Sahel, which is the semi-arid desert edge. And cutting a massive fertile path right through the middle of all this dry land is the vital artery of the Niger River.
It's an environment of intense extremes. And because you have these stark ecological differences packed so tightly together, you get what our sources call ecological specialization.
Right.
And this didn't happen because of an empire, right? I mean, this existed as a survival mechanism way before the large centralized states took over.
Yeah, the deep structures of this regional economy were generated by those exact complementary ecological endowments. Because the environment was so specific in each zone, like the savanna requiring one set of skills and the river requiring another, The people living there became hyper-specialized.
Which makes total sense. You adapt to where you live.
Exactly. And over generations, this extreme occupational specialization became deeply entwined with ethnic identity. Different ethnic groups essentially held virtual monopolies on specific economic resources.
I want to make this really concrete for you listening. If we are walking through this region in, say, 1700, who exactly is doing what?
Well, first you would encounter the Bambara. They are primarily the farmers of the region. They lived in incredibly tight-knit corporate farming communities, and their absolute focus was producing the surplus grain, specifically millet and sorghum. That provided the caloric baseline for the entire region.
So they are the breadbasket.
Right. Then out on the plains, you would find the Fub. They were the pastoral herders. They controlled the livestock, the cattle, and crucially, they controlled the region's milk and dairy supply.
And they had to move around a lot, right?
Yes, navigating their herds around the seasonal threats of tsetse flies, which were deadly to cattle.
So the Bambara provide the complex carbohydrates, and the Ful provide the protein and dairy.
Exactly. And tying those producers together, you have the Maraka.
The Maraka.
Yes. They were the merchants and the commercial manufacturers. They managed the complex trade routes, and they were the undisputed masters of producing cloth, particularly this highly valued indigo-dyed cotton.
And what about the river itself?
That brings us to the Samano. They handled the river. They were the fishermen, the boatmen, the ultimate transporters. Yeah, and ethnicity and occupation were woven so tightly together that to be born into one of these groups meant you were basically born into a very specific economic lane.
So think of it like a massive interlocking corporate supply chain, but forged purely by geography. You have the agricultural division, the livestock division, the manufacturing and logistics division.
That's a great way to put it.
And every group has a hyper-specific niche. No one is trying to be entirely self-sufficient because the environment is just too harsh to go it alone, right?
Exactly. The Maraka merchants need the Bambara's surplus grain to feed their trading caravans. The Bambara need the Maraka's dyed cloth for social and practical use.
And everyone absolutely relies on the Samano to move thousands of pounds of goods up and down the Niger River.
Right. So all the elements of a highly articulated regional economy were already functioning long before the big military states showed up. You had specialized producers servicing other specialists through the mediation of the market.
Right. So the fundamental tension of our narrative today is what happens when a powerful, highly centralized militaristic state emerges and decides to harness this delicate, interlocking ecosystem.
Does it crush it or does it supercharge it?
And to see that ecosystem get totally supercharged, we have to look at the early 18th century, around 1712, to the rise of the Segu Bambara state.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is it doesn't start with a massive conquering army invading from across the desert. It starts with a guy named Mamari Coulibaly and a local bachelor's association.
Yeah, the establishment of the pagan Segu Bambara state emerged locally, right from the very social fabric of the Bambara farming communities. Mamari Coulibaly basically organized what was essentially a young men's club, like a fraternity.
The sources explain that to fund their activities, these young men paid a voluntary contribution called jasongo,
Right.
which literally translates to the price of millet beer or hydromeal. Is essentially just guys chipping in for the keg.
I mean, literally. It was a community of equals, socializing, hunting together, and sharing resources.
So how does a drinking club become an empire?
Well, the transformation of that innocent voluntary jasongo is the genesis of the state. As Mamari Coulibaly gains charisma and power, he begins accumulating followers. And crucially, this includes captive slaves who become his fiercely loyal elite warriors.
Okay, so the dynamic shifts.
Exactly. As his power centralizes, the nature of that bachelor's association fundamentally mutates. That voluntary contribution for beer escalates into a rigid, systematic, and entirely involuntary taxation system.
Wow. It is the ultimate historical scope creep. You go from chipping in for weekend drinks to funding a standing army.
It really is. It became the financial bedrock of a political system rooted in institutionalized violence. For the elite slave warriors and the king, they actively maintained the psychological illusion of a community of equals. They shared the spoils of war just as they once shared beer.
But for everyone else.
For everyone else, the independent farmers, the fishermen, the merchants who were now forced to pay this tax under threat of violence, it was pure subjugation. As the state expanded and conquered new territories, the subjugated people didn't pay Gisongo anymore. They paid something called Nasongo.
And what does that translate to?
It translates to head price or soul price.
Soul price. That phrase is chilling. You are literally paying the state to allow you to keep breathing for another year.
It is a protection racket in its purest form.
It is. But I'm struggling with this conceptually. If a state operates as a giant extortion racket, constantly pillaging, launching military campaigns, enslaving neighboring populations, how does trade survive?
Right.
Because doesn't constant, unpredictable violence just terrify merchants and destroy that interlocking corporate supply chain we just talked about? I think one of the French explorers in our notes, René Caillet, maybe?
Yes.
Right. He actually traveled through the eastern parts of this region and explicitly documented that constant war against the Bambara had severely damaged commerce in the city of Jenny. He noted that merchants were terrified and trade was interrupted. So, logically, warfare equals a dead economy, right?
What's fascinating here is the difference between the frontier and the heartland. Callier was making an accurate observation of a specific geographical reality, but he was only observing the periphery.
Oh, interesting.
Right. On the violent fringes, warfare caused massive devastation. It depopulated entire zones and absolutely ruined trade. But within the central, consolidated heartland of the Segu Bambara state, that exact same war machine created a zone of unparalleled security.
I see. Because the army is projecting all of its violence outward, constantly terrorizing the borders, the center of the empire becomes an impenetrable fortress for commerce.
Exactly. Another French explorer, Anne Raphael, visited the region a bit later in 1848, and he observed something that deeply contradicted his European sensibilities.
What did he see?
Well, in Europe, the prevailing commercial doctrine was the flag follows the merchandise, meaning intrepid merchants take the risks to establish trade routes, and then the military eventually follows to protect those national interests.
Right.
But in the Middle Niger, Raphael noted that the merchandise follows the flag. The military vanguard violently carved out a massive safe conduct zone, and trade subsequently boomed right behind the impenetrable shield of the army.
So the state basically acts as a massive, heavily armed security firm for the merchants.
Precisely.
And the Segu Bambara were incredibly deliberate about this, right? The sources show they didn't just passively let trade happen, they actively engineered an environment for it to thrive.
They did. They established dedicated market police. If you are a traveling merchant bringing your goods to Segu, you don't have to worry about getting scammed because the state actively polices the weights and measures. Yeah, they ensure the cowrie shell currency is standardized. And if a foreign merchant gets into a legal dispute with a powerful local chief, the state almost always adjudicates the conflict in favor of the merchant. They guarantee safe conduct.
Which is incredible for business. But why? Why are these warlords suddenly so pro-business?
The state's motivation for this was entirely pragmatic. Waging war successfully on a subcontinental scale required a highly developed commercial infrastructure. The Bambara military needed muskets, they needed gunpowder, and they needed horses.
And none of that is produced locally.
Exactly. All of it had to be imported from long-distance traders. So, to acquire those war materials, the state needed a high-value commodity to trade and exchange. And the perpetual warfare on the borders yielded the tragic ultimate commodity of this era.
Human captives. Slaves.
Right.
This is the dark mechanical engine driving the entire economic boom of the heartland.
The captives taken in these peripheral border wars fed an expanding continental market for manpower. Many were traded away to the north and to the coast for the very weapons that perpetuated the cycle.
Right.
But critically for our story, a massive number of these enslaved people were retained internally. They were kept within the Middle Niger Valley to physically fuel local production. The state provided the impenetrable security umbrella, they provided the constant influx of captive labor, and the specialized ethnic groups took that labor and used it to massively scale up their commercial operations.
So let's examine the mechanics of how that wealth was actually generated locally, because two specific groups absolutely thrived under this Bambara war economy. The Maraca merchants and the Samono fishermen.
Let's start with the Maraca.
Yeah, because when we hear merchant in a pre-colonial context, the image that usually comes to mind is an itinerant peddler. Someone walking with a pack mule from village to village, buying low and selling high.
Sure.
But the Maraca operation was vastly more sophisticated than that.
Oh, completely. The Maraca functioned more like modern managers of complex, vertically integrated production and commercial firms. They were deeply sedentary. They built great cosmopolitan cities. And they took the immense profits they made from trade and reinvested them directly into agricultural and artisanal production. To achieve that massive scale, they relied entirely on the enslaved labor provided by the Bambara military machine.
And the notes detail this fascinating geographical split in how the Maraka actually operated. You had the Black Maraka living between the Niger and Bani rivers, who farmed primarily using the labor of large, independent, extended families.
Right.
But on the left bank of the Niger, you had the White Maraka, and they built enormous slave plantations. They were wealthy, they were devoutly Islamic, and their entire commercial empire rested on mastering what the sources call the desert side trade.
The desert side trade illustrates perfectly how ecological boundaries create massive wealth, if you position yourself as the gatekeeper.
Walk us through that.
So the Maraka towns, specifically places like Sansani and Nyaimina, were built directly on the banks of the Niger River. They serve as the absolute southern terminus for the nomadic peoples of the Western Sahara, the Moors. The Moors would bring rock salt, which was incredibly valuable, and other exotic goods down from the deep desert to trade for the essential calories of grain, manufactured cloth, and slaves.
But logically, why didn't the Moors just bypass the Maraka middleman? Why not just cross the river and deal directly with the Bambara farmers to get the grain at wholesale prices?
The ecology prevented it.
Really?
Yeah. The Moors relied on camels and desert-adapted horses. They were absolutely terrified of bringing their livestock into the wetter, more humid zones south of the river.
The tsetse fly?
Exactly. Those areas harbored the tsetse fly and other diseases that would just decimate their herds. So the river was a hard biological stop. Therefore, the Maraka towns became the perfect protected entrepôts.
That is brilliant.
The Maraka used their immense wealth to buy surplus grain from the Bambara, stockpiled it in massive granaries within their secure cities, and simply held it until the Moors arrived from the north.
So they are managing a massive logistical portfolio. They buy the grain, stockpile it, trade it to the Moors for salt, and then funnel that salt into the long-distance trade routes pushing further south.
Exactly.
But physically moving thousands of tons of grain, salt, and trade goods across a vast empire requires a logistics network that the Maraka couldn't build themselves. They needed our second group, right? The Samano.
Right. And the story of the Samano is where the intervention of the state into the economy becomes incredibly direct, almost heavy-handed.
How so?
Well, our sources reveal a really surprising fact. The Samano were not originally a distinct ethnic group at all.
Wait, really? Which totally upends the rule we just established about deep ecological specialization and ancient ethnic monopolies.
I know. The Samano are the engineered exception. The word Samano is simply the Bambara term for boatman. They were a professional caste, created, nurtured, and heavily regulated by the Segu Bambara state itself.
That is wild.
The state literally drafted people from various existing ethnicities, Soninke, Bambara, Bozo, Malinke, and fused them into a new state-sponsored occupational group.
It's as if the state recognized a critical logistical bottleneck moving troops across the river and just decided to invent a naval and transit authority out of thin air.
That's exactly what they did.
They granted the Samano an absolute legally enforced monopoly on river transit. But in exchange, the Samano had to move the military's troops, weapons, and supplies at a moment's notice whenever the king demanded it.
That is the core social contract. The state intervened in the riverine economy purely to fulfill its own institutional military needs. And to ensure the Samano could physically handle this immense logistical burden, the state channeled a huge portion of its captive labor to them and strictly engineered their demographics.
What do you mean by engineered their demographics?
Well, if you look at a historical map of the right bank of the Niger River during this era, the Samana settlements do not appear organically. They are spaced with a curious mathematical regularity, exactly 15 kilometers apart.
Oh, wow. That is a disciplined transit network imposed from the top down. A perfectly spaced relay system for an empire.
Exactly. And with that unshakable state backing and a massive influx of captive labor, the Samano completely revolutionized the technical character of fishing on the Niger.
Right, they moved beyond using small individual nets from tiny canoes.
Yes. They engineered a piece of technology called the basama.
The basama nets are just staggering to think about. I mean, these were massive, hand-woven nets, frequently over 300 meters long.
Incredible scale.
Just imagine the physical reality of that. 3 football fields of netting, heavy with water, fighting the current of the Niger River. You cannot deploy that with a couple of guys in a small boat.
No, not at all.
Using a basama requires immense, highly synchronized cooperative labor. It requires a flotilla of canoes working in perfect tandem.
And the Samano achieved that coordination by utilizing the captive labor provided by the state And it yielded an astronomical amount of fish, which was then dried and smoked, becoming a staple export commodity that fed the entire region.
And because they were the logistical backbone of the empire, the Samano operated with an absolute terrifying level of impunity. There is this gripping scene recorded by the famous Scottish explorer Mungo Park that visualizes this.
Oh, the canoe incident.
Yes. Park is traveling through the region and he witnesses an altercation. A local canoe owner refuses to hand his boat over to a group of Samano men. And the Samano do not negotiate. They do not appeal to a local magistrate.
They don't have to.
Right. They immediately attack the man, striking him across the forehead with a sword, cracking his brother's head open with a heavy wooden canoe paddle, and then they physically abduct the man's son to take him away as a slave, seizing the canoe in the process. And there is absolutely zero consequence for this violence. They are the untouchable transit mafia of the state.
That anecdote perfectly captures the raw power dynamics of the era. The Bambara war economy provided the security, the captive labor, and the violent legal framework that allowed the Maraca and the Samano to accumulate unprecedented wealth.
It was a massive engine of economic growth.
But an engine entirely reliant on the constant fuel of warfare.
Which means it is incredibly fragile. I mean, the entire interlocking corporate supply chain is perfectly balanced, but only if the state continues to wage war on the periphery and redistribute the spoils in a very specific way.
Right.
All it takes to bring the whole system crashing down is a hostile takeover, a change in upper management, bringing a fundamentally incompatible ideology. Enter the Umarian state.
Yeah, this is where everything shifts. In 1861, the Segu Bambara state is decisively conquered by Umar Tal and his Futanka warriors. This conquest brings about a profound and immediate rupture.
Because they were totally different ideologically.
Exactly. The Umarian state was a jihadist Islamic state, operating on a completely different ideological and economic logic than the Bambara.
Umar Tal divided the world strictly along theological lines. The abode of Islam, which is Dar al-Islam, and the abode of war, Dar al-Harb. Now, on paper, you would assume the Maraca, who are devout, wealthy Muslims, and the Samano, who are also Muslims, would be thrilled.
You would think so.
Yeah. A French eyewitness, Eugene Minage, even noted that the wealthy merchants initially welcomed Umar Tal because they anticipated the implementation of Islamic commercial law and lower taxes. But the reality on the ground was catastrophic, wasn't it?
It was a disaster. The economy of the riverine districts utterly collapsed under the Umarians. And this was not simply a case of administrative mismanagement or a few rogue, corrupt officials.
It was deeper than that.
It was a deep structural failure directly tied to how this new warrior state funded itself and understood its relationship to wealth. We can see this clearly in how they handled the division of booty.
Right, because both states, the Bambara and the Umarians, survived by capturing booty. But the mechanics of what they did with that wealth next were total opposites.
Exactly. In the Bambara system, the division of booty was negotiated through individual contracts between the king and his warriors. The king took the lion's share, of course, but the social expectation of those contracts meant he was obligated to redistribute a handsome portion of that wealth back to his warriors.
And critically, to logistical groups like the Samano to keep the military machine functioning. Wealth was violently acquired, but it was forced to circulate.
Right, it circulated. But how did the Umarians handle it?
Well, Islamic law, as strictly interpreted by the Umarians, defined the community entirely differently. The state didn't feel the need to build loyalty through financial redistribution because everyone was already supposedly bound by the religious dictates of the Sharia.
So booty was not divided based on individual heroics or negotiated contracts.
Nope. It was divided strictly by military hierarchy. The cavalry automatically received 3 times as much as the foot soldiers, regardless of individual contribution.
So the wealth instantly concentrates at the very top of the military structure, and the circulation stops dead.
And the situation was exacerbated by the profound resentment held by the Umarian warriors, the Talaba. These men were generally very poor. When they conquered this incredibly wealthy region, they looked at the Maraca merchants living in massive, cosmopolitan plantation houses and the Samano operating giant fleets of canoes, and they felt a deep ideological anger.
I can imagine.
Yeah, here they were, the holy warriors who had supposedly purified the land for Islam, living in relative penury, while the local merchants they had conquered were dripping in wealth.
So they just start confiscating it. The historical sources describe the absolute ubiquity of pillage. The Umarian warriors would simply walk into a compound and take whatever they desired, using religion as a thin veil for extortion.
Like a fake tax collection.
Exactly. They would claim they were merely collecting the zakat, the mandatory Islamic charitable tax. But there was no assessment, no due process. They just arbitrarily took cattle, grain, dyed cloth, or slaves whenever they wanted.
Wow. Put yourself in the position of a Morocco merchant or a Samano fisherman under those conditions. The psychological impact on economic behavior is immediate and devastating. If you know that at any given moment an armed soldier can walk onto your property and legally steal the livestock you just raised or the massive net you just spent a year weaving, what is your rational economic response?
You completely freeze. You do not build a bigger net. You do not clear a new field to plant more millet. You immediately stop investing capital or labor into any visible surplus.
Right. You bury your cowrie shells, you hide your goods, and you actively pretend to be poor so you don't become a target for the Talaba.
Capital investment completely dries up. And because the producers are actively avoiding generating a surplus, the massive regional grain markets simply starve.
The supply chain just breaks.
Completely. The entire intricate trade network, which relied on the Morocco pulling massive amounts of surplus grain from the Bambara to trade with the Moors, completely seizes up.
And the mechanics of starvation set in quickly. By 1889, there was a catastrophic famine in Segu. A single measure of millet, which used to be abundant, cost an astronomical 500 to 600 cowries.
That's inflation on a terrifying scale.
And the crisis reached all the way to the top. The sources indicate that 3 of the concubines of Amadou, Umar Tal's successor, literally starved to death inside the royal household.
The rulers are starving in their own palaces because their ideology completely dismantled the economic engine that fed them.
So what is the survival mechanism for a warrior state when commerce is dead, taxation is impossible, but you still have thousands of soldiers who need to eat today?
They turn to razzia, petty, relentless predation. Instead of launching grand, coordinated military campaigns against external enemies to bring in new wealth, the Umarian garrisons simply began raiding the local subject populations for daily survival.
So they just turned inward.
Yeah, they morphed from conquerors into heavily armed parasites feeding on their own people.
Which inevitably triggers massive regional revolts. The Bambara farmers, the Morocco merchants, the Samano boatmen, everyone who previously drove the economy takes up arms against the Umarians because the fundamental social contract is gone.
Right.
The Umarians demanded the Samano transport their troops, but they offered zero protection from raiders and provided no new captive labor to row the boats. They basically killed the golden goose.
The Umarians possessed the military tactics necessary to conquer a vast territory, but they completely lacked the political economy required to rule it. By creating conditions that actively punished capital investment and surplus production, they destroyed the foundation of their own state.
This complete systemic breakdown sets the stage for our third and final warrior state. The Umarians are politically fractured, the economy is in ruins, the local populations are in open revolt, and into this chaos, in 1883, marches the French colonial army, arriving at the Niger River near Bamako.
And this is a crucial phase, led by military commanders like Colonel Borgnes de Borde and subsequently Joseph Gallieni and Louis Archenard.
Right.
There is a common historical misconception that European colonial conquest meant the immediate, orderly imposition of modern, capitalist, civilian administration. But that is absolutely not the reality in the Middle Niger Valley in the 1880s.
Not at all.
Initially, the French military operated almost exactly like the Umarians before them. They functioned as a desperate warrior state, seeking booty, utilizing enslaved labor, and fighting for daily survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It's like watching a rogue branch office of a global corporation completely ignore headquarters. On the ground in Mali, you have French military commanders surrounded by hostile forces, operating at the end of an impossibly long supply chain thousands of miles from Paris.
Yeah.
To avoid starvation and defeat, they engineer what the sources explicitly call a barracks state. They rely on forced military requisitions of village grain. They capture and distribute booty to maintain the loyalty of local auxiliaries. And crucially, they actively participate in the pre-colonial system of slavery, using unfree labor to carry their artillery and build their forts.
But simultaneously, back in the Parisian headquarters, the civilian government and the metropolitan public sphere are operating on a completely contradictory set of ideologies.
Right, they have a totally different agenda.
Exactly. The political climate in France is increasingly championing free trade, open markets, and rigorous anti-slavery campaigns. You have highly influential figures, such as Cardinal of Vigerie and the politician Victor Schulcher, leading massive, emotive public crusades to definitively end the slave trade in Africa.
So picture the friction here. Paris is frantically telegraphing memos demanding human rights, the abolition of forced labor, and the implementation of free market capitalism. Meanwhile, the generals on the ground in Mali are tossing those memos into the fire, looking at their isolated garrisons, and calculating that if they don't use 500 enslaved laborers to build a supply bridge by Tuesday, the entire expeditionary force will be wiped out.
It's pure pragmatic survival versus metropolitan idealism.
Exactly. The French commanders, like Archinard, actually tried to resurrect the old traditional African state structures to manage the local economy for them, knowing that an immediate abolition of slavery would cause the entire agricultural system to instantly collapse. But that pragmatic authoritarian approach was totally incompatible with the free trade mandates being shouted from Europe.
It was an entirely unsustainable political tension. However, the military commanders were the ones physically holding the territory and the guns, so for nearly 2 decades, they won the argument by default. They maintained the barrack state.
Okay, so the generals are in charge.
For a while, yes. Yet, the deep historical irony is that the French military's sheer tactical success eventually engineered its own political irrelevance.
Wait, if the military is successful, they win the game. Why does winning make them irrelevant?
Because of the monopoly on violence. By 1898, the French expeditionary forces had decisively defeated the major regional military powers, most notably the state of Segu and the massive empire of Samori Touré. They had achieved a total, uncontested monopoly on war in the region. This fundamentally shifted the political economy. When warfare is no longer a desperate daily necessity for the state's very survival, the social and political reproduction of warriors is no longer the state's primary concern.
Right. I get it. If there are no massive armies left to fight tomorrow, you don't need a warlord general in charge today. The military commanders lose their leverage over the politicians back in Paris.
Precisely. The warrior administrators rendered themselves functionally obsolete. This massive reduction in military threat finally paved the way for civilian administrators dispatched from France to seize control of the colonial state from the military starting around 1899.
And the civilian administrators had a very different perspective.
Oh, completely. These civilian bureaucrats possessed a deep ideological hatred for the old economic structures. They despised the strict ethnic monopolies that restricted free trade, and officially at least, they were mandated to dismantle the systems of slavery.
Okay, so the metropolitan government in France genuinely wants to end slavery, but they are terrified of the mathematics of it. They want a highly managed, agonizingly slow transition because they know that if all the unfree labor vanishes from the fields overnight, the grain supply vanishes and the new colonial economy crashes.
Right, they want control.
But the people actually enslaved on the ground. They had a completely different timeline in mind, and they were not waiting for bureaucratic approval. Which brings us to the absolute climax of our narrative, the 1905 rupture.
The year 1905 marks the definitive end of an era. It was the ignition point of a massive, seemingly spontaneous exodus of enslaved people, beginning in the wealthy Maraca plantation town of Banamba. Over the next 6 years, this exodus cascaded, village by village, throughout the entirety of the Western Sudan.
The obvious question is, why 1905?
Yeah.
Why didn't this massive walkout happen in 1895 or when the French first arrived in 1883? What is the specific trigger?
We have to trace the causality back to the French monopoly on war in 1898. Remember, 1898 is when the French finally defeated Samori Touré and Segu.
Yes.
Well, for decades, those two military powers were the primary engines driving the capture and supply of new slaves into the regional market. Once the French eliminated them, the supply of new human captives plummeted almost immediately to zero.
It is brutal. Demographic supply and demand. The supply of new labor drops to zero, so the market price of existing enslaved people skyrockets.
Exactly. The wealthy Maraca plantation owners suddenly found themselves completely cut off from new labor. They could no longer afford to replenish their workforce. But simultaneously, the French colonial administration is fundamentally altering the economic landscape.
How so?
They are constructing the Dakar-Niger Railway and establishing rapidly growing administrative towns like Bamako. The demand for grain to feed these new urban centers is exploding.
So the Maraca are caught in an impossible squeeze. They're looking at this incredibly lucrative, massive new French market for their grain, but their labor force is static and aging.
Right.
The only mechanism they have to increase production is to enforce unimaginable brutality. They start squeezing impossible yields from starving laborers. They severely overwork their existing enslaved populations, drastically increasing the physical demands while the labor pool shrinks.
The physical toll reached a breaking point. The historical record actually shows us the early localized warning signs of this pressure a full decade earlier.
Really?
Yeah, in 1895, a French customs collector documented a highly specific incident. An enslaved man named Benanfiel Jara organized 30 other enslaved men in the town of Banamba. Armed with nothing but the heavy iron hose they used for farming, they launched a direct, violent physical revolt against their masters.
30 exhausted men with farming tools against their masters. It was localized and it was suppressed, but it proved that the internal pressure of the system was critical.
Absolutely. Fast forward to 1905, and the response is no longer an isolated armed revolt. It evolves into a massive, unstoppable, silent walkout. The enslaved people simply put down their tools, gathered what little they had, and began walking away from the plantations by the thousands.
And what does the French administration do?
Well, their response highlights their deep hypocrisy. Despite decades of lofty anti-slavery rhetoric in Paris, the administrators on the ground panicked. They stared at the very real prospect of total agricultural collapse.
Right. In June of 1905, local French commandants actually mobilized forces to try and halt the exodus, attempting to physically force the fleeing people back to the plantations to reestablish the customary relationship between masters and slaves.
The supposed great liberators of Africa, using their own troops to force enslaved people back into the fields just to ensure the railway towns kept getting their grain shipments.
Exactly. But the sheer scale of the movement overwhelmed them. The formerly enslaved people essentially called the French bluff. They tested the colonial state's actual commitment to personal freedom, and by 1906, the French administration realized they were entirely powerless.
They just couldn't stop it.
To stop the exodus would require fighting a massive, bloody, region-wide war against the very people they claimed to have liberated. They capitulated, stepped back, and let the people leave.
Wow. We need to crystallize the ultimate outcome of this moment. When the dust settles on this massive walkout, what happens to the interlocking corporate supply chain we started with? The economic rupture was absolute and permanent. The sudden evaporation of captive labor destroyed the foundational wealth of the Morocco overnight. The great cosmopolitan plantation cities like Banamba, Touba, and Kairouan rapidly fell into physical ruin as their populations dispersed.
It totally rewrote the map.
And the demographic shift profoundly altered the culture as well. The scholar Paul Marty observed that the suppression of slavery dealt a severe blow to the practice of local Islam in those specific areas.
Oh, that's an interesting ripple effect. Why?
Well, the wealthy Moroccan masters, who previously spent their days in study and prayer while slaves worked the fields, were suddenly forced to perform the grueling agricultural labor themselves just to survive. Marty bluntly noted that they no longer had much time or enthusiasm for praying.
I mean, they were too exhausted from swinging the hose themselves. But out of this collapse comes an incredibly dynamic consequence. The rigid, ancient ethnic monopolies, the rule that only the Morocco could weave and dye cloth, and only the Simono could navigate the river, that entire system completely dissolves.
It shatters. The sudden availability of free labor shattered the old guild-like restrictions. Freed slaves, independent Bambara farmers, and even former Simono boatmen realized the market was completely open. Everyone started cultivating cotton and producing the lucrative indigo-dyed cloth.
Just a free-for-all.
Yeah, a frustrated French commandant in Segu explicitly complained in 1901 that the high-quality cloth, which was formerly the exclusive, highly regulated domain of the Morocco, was suddenly being copied and produced by everyone across the region.
And the Simono.
The Simono lost their absolute grip on the river. As the grain market expanded to feed the railway towns, European commercial houses brought in their own transport boats and simply hired paid free labor sailors, permanently breaking the Simono transit monopoly.
So the ancient rigid caste system melted down and re-solidified into a much more fluid, competitive, and distinctly modern labor economy.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the vital takeaway from the entire 200-year history. The French colonial state certainly created the overarching legal and military conditions. They established the absolute monopoly on violence that finally ended the internal wars and choked off the slave trade. But the colonial state did not build the new economy.
Who did?
It was the everyday African people. The newly freed laborers fleeing the plantations, the highly adaptive Bambara farmers, the ambitious former slaves claiming new trades. They actively and intelligently fashioned the flexible new economy of the 20th century. They looked at the new rules imposed by the French, and they immediately capitalized on them to secure their own survival and freedom.
That is just incredible. It is time to take a breath and recap this incredible journey.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We started by watching a Bambara Bachelors Club transform a voluntary beer tax into a terrifying economic powerhouse built entirely on warfare. And ironically, creating a golden age of secure trade in their heartland by terrorizing their borders. Then we saw an Umarian jihadist state conquer that exact same wealthy region and utterly crush its economy through unmanaged ideological predation, violently stealing the wealth until the rulers themselves starved in their palaces.
Total collapse.
And finally, we watched a French military machine roll in, accidentally engineer its own obsolescence by winning too many battles, and inadvertently trigger a massive spontaneous slave liberation that permanently reshaped the entire social fabric of West Africa.
And throughout every phase of this history, to me, the constant, undeniable thread is that economies are never simply abstract lines on a graph, and they are never disconnected from political violence.
Never.
They are deeply human systems, profoundly and immediately shaped by power, military force, and the specific logistical needs of whatever state holds the monopoly on violence. The market always responds to the specific environment the state enforces, whether that is a protected commercial enclave fueled by captive labor, a parasitic zone of arbitrary plunder, or a newly open landscape defined by the chaotic emergence of free labor.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as we close this out.
Yeah.
History books have a terrible habit of naming eras after the kings, the generals, and the conquerors who supposedly ruled them. We talk about the era of Coulibaly, the era of Umar Tal, the era of the French commander Archinard.
It's true.
But when you look closely at the total collapse of the old world order in 1905, the absolute turning point of this entire history, it wasn't a French general in a fancy uniform who finally changed the world.
No, it wasn't.
It was the people at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. It was the enslaved people in Banamba, men like Bananfield Jara, who simply decided that the physical toll was too high, dropped their farming hoes, and walked away.
They just walked away.
It forces us to look at our own modern structures and ask, who are the invisible, unacknowledged laborers physically holding up the foundation of our global economy today? And what exactly happens to the whole machine if they decide to stop?
That's a powerful question.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you. Keep looking for the hidden human choices behind the grand historical narratives, and we will see you on the next deep dive.